You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Well, we have video, so you can see me smiling right away because I've got a good one for you today. So, IAM is probably not the trendiest industry out there,
Shocking.
but we do have our fair share of trends, right? Zero trust, passwordless, hybrid cloud. Those are all themes and trends that we've heard a lot about from our clients the last few weeks, and I'd like to throw another one out there. Using Lotus Notes as an identity request platform. What do you think?
I remember the year 2000 fondly, and it is now the year 2021. It's definitely not modern. If it works, it works. There are certainly better ways to do it, but this is kind of that old. I don't know what the saying is, but it's not stupid if it works. There's some degree to truth to that, but it could be so much better.
It needs a hashtag. I will say that we've mostly been hearing it in the vein of it needs to go away. But it's interesting how it happens where, everybody's talking about, zero trust, passwordless, hybrid cloud. It just so happens that I haven't seen Lotus Notes much lately. And then we run into a couple of clients all in a row where they're using Lotus Notes still for identity management. And it's one of those fun things.
It's interesting when we see those bunches of clients like that, where it's like you don't see a technology for a while, and then all of a sudden it's like 3-4 clients in a row, right? All have the same thing. The same thing I think happened with me earlier this year with Easy Vista. It's an ITSM tool, ticketing basically. I had never heard of it until earlier this year, and then I had 2 customers in a row that were using it. So it certainly seems like there's some sort of like cyclical event that takes place where, maybe companies of like mind and like technology are maybe on the same sort of, cycle of refresh or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I feel like pretty safe in saying that nobody's going to get angry that we're saying Lotus Notes should not be the access request platform, right? I think it's pretty safe to, say that was shooting fish in a barrel to say that one that needs to go. That's low hanging fruit.
Well, I think the IBM people might disagree because I think it is a fairly powerful platform for what it can do. So I think if you've built an application on it, you could make an argument against it. Do I agree with it? No. There's certainly, I think, more modern interfaces that could be used, and it certainly adds a lot of tech debt to the environment. So personally, no, not a fan of Lotus Notes.
I've been to a lot of IBM presentations at Gartner and other conferences, and there was no mention of you should use Lotus Notes for your access request platform. So I'm going to defend the IBM people here and say that they do not make that claim these days.
Well, you know what? Here, let's issue a challenge to our listeners. If you work for IBM, and if you work with Lotus Notes, and you feel like we have wronged you in some way here with this conversation, please reach out. The invitation is open. Come on the show. Tell us why we're wrong. I think that's the great thing about having an opinion is it can change based on facts. So I'll issue that. I don't want to call it a challenge, but I'll issue that offer. How about that? Where if you feel like there is a path forward for using Lotus Notes as your IAM platform, meaning access requests, automation, governance, all those types of things that we typically find like in an IGA perspective or identity governance and administration perspective. Hit us up on LinkedIn. I would certainly welcome that conversation because I would love to see a different viewpoint or hear a different viewpoint on that.
Yeah, well, on some of those other trends like passwordless and hybrid cloud, we've got a fantastic guest to talk about this week.
Yeah, why don't we introduce him? His name is Tom Malta. He's the CEO and Principal of IAM Experts, LLC. He also happens to be the Identity Defined Security Alliance IAM Evangelist of the Year, which is totally a mouthful. So welcome to the show, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us. So, is tradition with our podcast here, we always like to find out the origin story of people and how they got into the identity space or maybe InfoSec at large. So, tell us, how did you get into IAM? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, great question. I think like many people, it chose me, right? So, been in financial services my whole career. Started off as a developer supporting front office trading systems back in the day, right? And I really enjoyed doing that work and actually moved over to Goldman in 2000. Visions of grandeur, right? Less than a year later, 9/11 happens. We all got displaced, and the project that I was on, of course, got cut. But I landed in the security space, and at first it was spending some time looking at Sarbanes-Oxley and some of the emerging regulations just coming after, 9/11. But then quickly moved into what was told to me by the CISO then, great mentor Phil Venables, the CISO over at Google Cloud. He's like, "Hey Tom, we got this flailing IAM project that we'd like you to come and take over." So I went over and started it and stayed there 8 years. That was the first of many programs. It's been a great, successful run the last 20 plus years now.
So you've got a ton of experience in the space, and I know that you also have worked with a couple of kind of important players in the IAM kind of industry itself, including Okta, where you've done some strategic advice, I think, for them, and then maybe the financial services side of things. And I know you're also doing some work with Strata.io. Those are companies that we've actually had on the show recently. We had Sammy Lane on recently talking about Zero Trust from Okta, and we had Jerry Gable from Strata.io to talk about identity orchestration. How did those relationships come up where you've been able to lend your experience in the financial services side of things to kind of help out those organizations and really move forward IAM for all of us?
Yeah, great question, Jeff. And it came when I was working at Navy, right? I've since left there. And by the way, ironically, they're also a Lotus Note shop, by the way. So,
Condolences.
yeah, condolences, right? So I started working with Strata probably last summer. Got turned on to them, actually, ironically, from Alberto Yepes, which some of you probably remember who were listening on the podcast. He actually was the first person I met in the IAM space when I was at Goldman, little company called Thor Technologies that got bought by Oracle and became ultimately Oracle 9G and then Oracle OIM. But he reached out to me last summer after I left Wells and said, "Hey, I got this company that you should take a look at." So I've been working with them a little bit on helping to connect them to a lot of the people I'm connected to, just to get people aware of what they do. And two great things they do, which is IDP orchestration, kind of bringing together all your disparate identity solutions, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud, and orchestrating authentication, if you will. And the other thing that they do really well is they help migrate off of legacy platforms, right? So if you're on a old SiteMiner or you're on an old Oracle platform and you want to move to something like Okta or something new, by using Strata, you can do that with no code changes. So really excited to be working with them. And then Okta is more recent, about 2 months now. Got connected from them. Ironically, a story I'll share with you guys and for your listeners. Back in 2008, when I was actually laid off from Goldman, and it was a great separation. They treated me really well. But I was driving home in the rain, and I took an interview with Freddie and Todd, the co-founders of Okta, and actually did pretty well on the interview. Got an offer to come out and move to California, and probably would have been, I don't know, employee less than number 10 or whatever at the time, but chose not to. And, long story short, here I am, many years later, working with them again. And Freddie reached out to me also last summer. And long story short, a couple months ago, an opportunity came to bear there for me to come in and help them build out their go-to-market strategy in the financial services vertical. So, been doing some presentations, some webinars, some roundtables with financial services clients. So it's been great. It's great to, as you guys know, as peers in the space, when you get to flip from kind of buying the sausage to watching how the sausage is made. It's kind of an interesting switch, right? But it's been very enjoyable.
Yeah, that's definitely one of my favorite lines that I always use with our clients. So we're gonna make the sausage together. Yeah, you got a lot of exciting stuff going on there, Tom. But not the least of which was you were recently named the Identity Defined Security Alliance IAM Evangelist of the Year. I'd love to hear more about that. We've had Julie Smith on the podcast. She's actually the reigning champion of guest appearances on our podcast. And she said to myself and Jeff, "Hey, have you had Tom Malta on the podcast yet?" It's like I've known Tom now for about 10 years, and I think it's about time to have him join the show. But definitely want to hear more about this I Am Evangelist of the Year, kind of what led to that. And obviously, we know that process. Somebody must have nominated you. And usually that's tied to some kind of evangelist activities that you're doing in the space. So give us a little bit of background there.
Yeah, sure. And certainly a little plug for the IDSA, right? I've been working with them now for, I don't know, almost 4 years, I think, plus. And great organization, really big fan of Julie and everybody there. As you guys know, it brings together a bunch of different vendors in IAM and even more broadly across cyber together with practitioners like us, right? And our goal is to, make it better for everybody out there in the ecosystem, whether you're doing your fifth IAM implementation or your 15th or your first, really to try to help people be successful, right? So it's been a great run. And yeah, how that award came about when I heard about it, and obviously I heard about it from the inside because I'm on the board. I asked the team, I'm like, hey, be interested to see, how votes come in and so forth. And to your point, Jim, you had to have peers or vendors or relationships that have worked with you actually fill out a nomination form for you. And so it wasn't just a strict, hey, here's Tom Malta, click the box kind of thing. They actually had to put some time into it. So when I found out I won, I was obviously very excited about it, but also very humbled to see that, after 20 years, getting to know that you made a difference in the space is certainly something that you're proud of, right? So it's been great to accept that award, and I hope to continue to honor them going forward this year.
Yeah, I definitely agree. All the kudos to the organization. Also, all the kudos to you. I mean, I've known you for over a decade, and I think the evangelist angle is also about just kind of a desire to not only talk up the industry, because I think that's important, but you've mentioned the IAM practitioner several times, being out there and wanting to help others. I mean, it's pretty much as simple as that. I think that's a big part of. Probably why you were selected, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that because I think that's just such an important angle for everybody to take, right? Is when you have some experience, pass it on to that next generation.
It is, and that's a great question, Jim. I think, I kind of pride myself with all the different programs I've had an opportunity to work in or lead that, I come in and I give people, a straight scoop on what they need to do, right? And it's interesting, even going from company to company, a lot of times people, even on an interview, will say to me, yeah, we have a really big problem going on in the IM space. We need somebody like you to come in and fix it for us. But the reality is that a lot of people are struggling with that, right? And I think, whether you're just starting out or, you're 3 years or 5 years into it, there's always places where you can do better, right? So trying to work with people and give them, my experience and the benefits, the scars, if you will, that I've gained, right? Because we've all made mistakes in life, and I've certainly had my share. One I always like to tell people about is role-based access control, right? I've been really a big fan of role-based access control for many years now. I actually even started a LinkedIn group at one point because I was so excited about the space, right? And you guys might remember, back in the day, there were the bridge streams and the Values and the Eurekifys out there, right? Those are the individual role-based access control companies. And then they all got subsumed by, whether it was Oracle, CA, or Sun, right? Each of them got subsumed. And then they became part of the IGA stack and they weren't as good. And what I like to tell people is that, I probably have done, I don't know, 7 or 8 different RBAC programs now, and at least two or three of them were major failures, right? And you share that with people just to say, hey, we don't always get things right. In fact, the very first one that we did at Goldman was a failure because we really didn't understand it, right? We didn't know what we were getting into. We created way too many roles. And a year later, we scrapped the whole thing and got rid of it. So, but I'm actually happy to say, as I roll the clock forward now to your point about being an evangelist, trying to learn from, if you think about like certifications of access, right? We don't want people doing line item certifications anymore. If I think about my time at Wells Fargo, we had literally millions of line item certifications happening every quarter, right? Ridiculous amount of, people that were involved and time and rubber stamping, right, going on. So I think the industry needs to change, right? So the thing I've been pushing a lot lately with peers, and you guys are aware of this too, is just to do it more tied to coarse grain roles, right? So you can actually, eliminate people sitting in front of a screen going through line item certifications and instead just looking at exceptions, right? So I guess I'll use that as an example to your question, Jim, circling back to say, that's kind of the way I think about the space. I really love it. I try to always think about new ways to make it better. And there's certainly more room for improvement, right?
I think roles are extremely hard. I think a lot of organizations say they want to get to roles and then they realize how hard it is and they give up halfway through it. Or, it ends up in a failure. Part of it, I think, is just the maturity of the organization, not having the discipline to be able to actually sit down and have a structure or a method to the madness, right, of creating it. I'm a fan of, attribute-based access control. And instead of having, one role or two roles, having more of a layered approach where you can say, okay, the first attribute is I'm an employee and I know that all employees get an email account. Great. Okay. Well, that's a decision that you're taking out of the hand of someone. You can automate that or, at least make it easier to obtain. And then maybe because I'm in a physical location of Chicago, I get some sort of access that's associated with Chicago. Maybe it's building access, right? Or something like that. So being able to kind of macro the role approach, I think is very helpful. Doesn't eliminate the need for micro roles or more role-based access control type issues like that, but I find that easier to start with, and you start to develop, I think, better habits over time. But it does require good data hygiene as well, right? If you don't know who your employees are or who your non-employees are, which is something I think a lot of organizations struggle with, not treating identity at the same rigor that they might for an employee, that makes it challenging as well. So I think it's really interesting that you've seen that failure firsthand, and it's something that I think is a lesson learned for a lot of organizations as you move forward. Think about how hard it is. It's harder even than that. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yeah. And you're spot on, Jeff. I think ABAC and now even PBAC, right? Policy-based access control for the fine grain stuff. So the strategy I try to push now is ABAC with coarse grain roles, right? Tied to birthright. Try to give it out as people come in, give them the coarse grain access, eliminate the provisioning of it, eliminate, meaning the manual provisioning of it, right? Eliminate the certification of it if you can get them in role and you don't have to go through all those line items. And then for the fine grain stuff, look at like a plain ID, for instance, right? Or something like that where you can do policy based, make API calls from the applications, do it just in time. Jim, you threw out a buzzword that I always love to ask people their definition of, which is zero trust, right? And to me, it means a lot of different things. And certainly every person you talk to will have a different definition. But, in the IAM space, right, it's all about giving people that least amount of privileges, right? So if I don't have to give you something until the very moment that you need it and only grant it for that split second and then take it away, what could be better than that in terms of a zero trust concept, right? So I really love where the PBAC space is going and that whole fine grain authorization. And I'm excited to see, that continue to develop in the industry.
Yeah, I think another thing to consider too is when it comes to role-based access control, it sometimes goes against the principle of least privilege. Sometimes they are not, they are not equal, right? I think you have to be smart and take risk-based decisions, for both. But at the end of the day, do you really care who's looking at the cafeteria menu? Probably not, right? So, why make that even be a decision, right? That somebody either has to ask for it or make it part of the, the risk calculus. But it is something to balance when you consider role-based access control. You may end up giving people more access than they actually need in the real world. And I think that's why a good partnership with the business and really understanding, hey, if we make this a role, everyone who's in this role is going to get it. Is that really what you want? And if the risk is low, then maybe it isn't. If the risk is not tolerable, then maybe there's a better approach, right, to addressing that specific access.
Yeah, that's spot on, Jeff. And I think with the coarse grain approach, you're less likely to do that, right? If you can get people, sort of around that Venn diagram, right, in that dead center of everything that they absolutely need versus things that they may or may not need. Because to your point, I mean, I guess the religion with RBAC is you're either in role or you're out of role. There is no such thing as that you've got some of the attributes or some of the entitlements. You either have them all or you have none of them. Now, if you don't use them all, to your point, you've just broken the whole concept of zero trust, right? You're granting access to somebody who is not using it, right? So,
yeah, and I think it gets exasperated too when you have this idea of both on-prem and cloud, and then some organizations also have multi-cloud, right, where they're having to manage AWS and Azure and GCP. And while I think most organizations would love to be on, sole source for a cloud provider when it comes to that sort of thing, I think the reality is sometimes, they're probably on two, right? Maybe it's AWS and Azure, maybe it's, Azure and GCP or Google Cloud Platform, whatever it may be. And I know that trying to manage identities and especially permissions across clouds can be challenging because they have different definitions
yeah.
Of what of what an access may be. There's always kind of variations, and I know that Strata IO has been kind of working on that, and they call it I think it's the identity fabric. And you also wrote an article about this on IDSA's website about a security strategy for hybrid clouds, and I'll put a link to this in our show notes, but maybe just as a conversation topic, can you kind of explain, at a high level, what was that article about, and we can kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, and great lead in. Thank you for that. So I think, when you talk about, Google, Azure, and AWS, I like to think of them as apples, oranges, and bananas. So I start to use my fruit analogy, right? They don't talk to each other. They have different ways of managing identity, right? Groups, policies, and roles are different across all three structures. So when you think about companies and in terms of, when you think about multi-cloud, 5 years ago, people would say, hey, I want to put everything into AWS. That's what I'm doing. That's my cloud strategy, right? Well, that's probably not, if you go back and ask that customer, that's probably not their cloud strategy now, right? It's probably, hey, we're going to put some things in AWS. My marketing team wants to put some stuff into Google to take advantage of its analytics power. And I might also, be partnering with Microsoft on some stuff. So I might have stuff in Azure. So that's one way that you start to see the breakup of multi-cloud management, right? Another is geographical reasons, right? You might have particular needs for running something in a particular location that AWS gives you a better price point than maybe Azure does, right? So you want to take advantage of that. Also, what I'm starting to hear, and you guys might be hearing this too, companies are starting to think of, and this happened to Microsoft, twice in the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 months, where an authentication went down. And it was only down for a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, whatever it was. But as you guys know, in financial services, which is the space I work in, a couple of seconds is a couple of $1 million, maybe, or a couple of $1 billion, right? We can't necessarily afford to be down at all. So when you start to think about a cloud strategy, it's like, well, what happens if my primary cloud goes down? Do I want to have a backup CSP, or do I want to bring it back on-prem? So this adds more complexity, right, to managing deployments, managing access, because if I have to deploy a container to multiple places, right, how do I do that and how do I manage it, at once? So
Yeah, I think what you're getting at there, Tom, is also just the idea of vendor lock-in. Um, Imagine this scenario. I mean, we see clients all the time who are saying, hey, we're a Microsoft shop. We're moving everything up to Azure. Now, what if you change your mind or change your strategy a couple years out? The more you've invested, the more you've gone all in on a single vendor, the harder it is going to be to extract that. That's why I kind of feel like there's always going to be a place for best of breed for especially the middleware space like identity management. Um, so but I also, I just want to key off of one point you made there, because you mentioned how authentication was down for a few seconds, and that's bad enough of an impact. But who's to say that's as far as it could go, right? What if it was down for a few minutes or a few hours, or what about a few days? I think, what we're seeing in ransomware was kind of like, okay, people started taking it seriously when the ransom started going into the millions, and then they're in the tens of millions. But who's to say it's going to stop there? What about when it's in the hundreds of millions? I mean, you know, who's to say what the finish line is for all of this? So I think, there are lots of reasons why companies will be driven into the hybrid or multi-cloud environment. Um, but I wanted to take us, if I could, to some of the points you made in your article. You were kind of, I think, getting behind the idea that there should be a centralized team around the management of the clouds, right? You would have a cloud identity team, but at the same time, you'd have specialists for each one of those clouds, because they operate so differently from an IAM perspective. Did I get that right?
You did, Jim. Yeah, I think especially as you're starting out, right? I think like even when I was at Navy, we're breaking into Azure and Azure AD, right, as an example. If you go out and try to find these people, you're not necessarily going to find them easy, number one. Two, if you try to find people with Azure and AWS or Azure and GCP or all three maybe, you're really going to be challenged, right? Because people are not as familiar with each of those products, other than maybe on a singular basis, right? Unless you find that unicorn out there, which is really rare. So you did get that right, and I think over time, you can certainly build your bench, right? I think internally, so that you can have engineers and support administrators actually supporting both. The other real trick, though, as you know, is going back to the apples, oranges, and bananas, right? How do you manage the orchestration of identities? How do you manage the access levels across those three, right? Particularly when you're trying to equalize those payloads. That's the real challenge, right? So I think with companies like Strata, and even Plain ID and some others out there, where you can bring policies back to a centralized point and manage them in one place, where you can bring back IDP and authentication back to a centralized place and manage it. I think that will give you advantages of being able to scale that better and be able to build it out more appropriately. I think, look, there's no silver bullet right now. I think it's such a new topic that I think people are still trying to figure it out, right? And we'll probably see some more companies emerge with functionality to help support it better. But it's definitely here to stay, right? Because I think people have gotten smart and hey, yeah, it might have been, $1 to go into AWS, but now it's $10 to come out of it because, it's that much more harder to unwind once you're in there.
Yeah, I think you, you made a really good point there about finding that unicorn as well. I think that's one thing that we see universally in the IAM spaces. It's hard to find talent. Now, if you have that unicorn, not only the unicorn that you want to hire, but they're a unicorn that everybody wants to hire, it's hard enough to find people that know Okta or SailPoint, the kind of the leaders in their space, where there are hundreds of companies that have that technology and people who are working on that technology. Is still a challenge or a struggle to find talent and get them to come to work for your company. Um, I'll put a put a personal opinion out there, especially if you don't have kind of flexible work from home policies. I think more and more people are looking for those things out of a job opportunity these days, and the more you can work with a global workforce, I think that puts you in a position of being able to attract and retain talent as well. But yeah, I mean, there's a huge lack, or a huge gap between the amount of infosec and IAM talent that is needed and the amount that exists out there. I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so Jim, I think great question. I think, when I talk to just peers and even, family and other people in the IT industry as a more broader topic, they said to me, yeah, well, cybersecurity seems to be great because there's always tons of jobs out there. Well, there is tons of jobs. I do think it depends on when you look at the level of those jobs, right? A lot of them will be a lot of intro jobs, people who were either, positions that are like 3 to 5 years or less, right? I think you might see some of the middle tier, but when you're looking for those really experienced people, the 5 to 7 to 10 year people, they're a lot harder to find. When you're looking for leaders to come in and run major functions for you, whether it's operations or, maybe it's SIAM or YM or whatever it might be, those people are even harder to find, right? And the jobs are also few and far between. So I do think your point about work from home, it's interesting, and I've seen the spectrum of feedback and thoughts on this, right? I've seen it go from some companies who were very much completely on-prem, go completely the opposite way, 180 degrees, and everybody can work remote now, right? And that's like probably a very rare one of the companies that I've seen do that. A lot of people who were working somewhat remote have now started to adopt what's more common, this hybrid approach where maybe a person's got to come in the office a day or two a week and then can work, the other couple of days from home. But let's be honest, guys. I mean, we just got through 18 months or more of people working 100% remote with no direct interaction to our customers, to our employers, to our peers, to the industry as a whole. And we were quite successful at it, right? And the economy didn't suffer. We didn't have, anything major occur, in terms of, corporations failing and things like that, right? So it's obviously a method that can still work. I think people get sort of, to your point, Jim, stuck in their, morals, if you will. Hey, I just want everybody in the office in front of me because that's just, the way I want to run my shop. And I can understand that, but I do think that's a little bit of 1970s-ish thinking, right? I do think people need to be more flexible. And certainly, I can tell you from my own experience hiring people, one of the first questions I get is, how many days do I have to be in the office, or can I work completely remote? And it's usually, the first or second question in the interview, right? Particularly if the person is that unicorn and has multiple different options on the table, right? And you're trying to attract them over to you, right? So I think it's a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly miss the business travel. I miss the first class upgrades, which I don't know will ever will ever come back to me. But overall, I've enjoyed this past 18 months from that perspective. Um, the other great thing about our industry is that there's always new stuff, always things that are getting hot. One thing that is not new is the password, but one thing that I think, we've all wanted to kill the password for a long time. We often laugh on this podcast about the Bill Gates quote back in 2006 that the password he declared the password dead. This is Bill Gates, right? And he is actually a visionary, but in this one he was a little too far ahead of himself. Um, the password is certainly not dead out there, but passwordless technology is blistering hot right now. And I'm wondering, kind of, what is your perspective? Are you seeing the same kind of excitement, or at least the willingness of companies to say that, look, this is a technology that we're really ready to, uh, at least dip our toe into, because, we either need to improve the way we're managing passwords, and that's going to take an investment, or why don't we just, take the next step and go passwordless?
Yeah, great question, Jim. And one of my favorite topics, right? I think I can go back to my days at Synchrony, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And that was the first time where I started thinking about passwordless in terms of, can we actually make this happen at the company? And we weren't able to do it then. I think, some of the technology was rather new. There wasn't a lot of support from the top, right? When I went to Wells and I spent a couple of years there, there was more support for it, but I think the technology was still just getting out into the industry, right? If I look at the last year, I think it's taken off, right? Particularly with COVID and some of the things that have occurred around it. So let's kind of take a few steps back, if you will, right? If you think about, 18 months ago when people were in the office, including the firewall technician, right? That firewall technician was sitting in the office. He might even only be single factoring in to make firewall changes. Why? Because he's on-prem, and we basically had single factor to get him into the network, right? Because you got physical security, you've got turnstiles, you've got badges to get into the offices and so forth. Now COVID happens. That firewall technician is now working remote. So he and everybody is now at least two-factor authentication, right, to get in. So I think, that one of the things that I think has started people thinking about this is saying, hey, Tom, when everybody goes back to the office, should we be employing two-factor authentication minimally? Because we've just been living with it in 18 months and I kind of like it, right? And I like having that extra security layer. And then the other question that comes up is how can we make it better, right? How can we make it stronger? Because the traditional user ID and 8-character password, which is in, frankly, most corporations in the world, which means it's greater than 50%, right, can be cracked in less than 2 hours. And I can do it on my laptop, right, while I'm actually running this call. So it's a little scary when you think about that, right? We need stronger ways to authenticate. So I'm really excited about the space. Actually, Hyper is one of the firms that we work with at Okta, who we've been actually really great partners with us and spending some time with them. There's also another company emerging called One Cosmos, who actually has a different spin on it, built on a blockchain, but also truly passwordless. If you ask me my crystal ball, I think when I talk to my peers at like the top 10 banks, there's at least two or three of them that have already made the decision to start to move to truly passwordless, and the others are actually all thinking about it, right? And I will tell you, the customers that we're talking to, at least a lot of the Okta customers in the financial services space, they're all thinking about it as well. So I think the wave is starting, Jim, right? And Jeff, I think it's, are we at the pinnacle of it? Has it reached its quote unquote hype phase? I don't think so. I think it's still growing, but I'm really excited to see a lot of firms starting to adopt it. And I'm really excited to see the software firms out there, and then particularly some of the newer ones, being very successful at it as well.
I think, like most things, we see the financial industry lead on some of this stuff with passwords and passwordless, I guess is the way to approach it. And the question I always have in my mind is, okay, I know if I'm an organization, I already have Microsoft or Okta or Ping or whoever, and they have their own versions of what passwordless looks like. It's not really passwordless, but it's maybe good enough. And then the question, if I'm putting my financial hat on, is why do I spend the money to go that extra 30% or 20% to go true passwordless? And I think that's a challenge that I think companies like Hyper and One Cosmos and others that are in the passwordless space need to figure out how they can best address that, because financial implications are a reality of the environment, where if I'm already paying for Microsoft through my E5 license or whatever it may be, why do I need a premium on top of that if good enough is good enough? Any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think to that point, I think the adoption is still going to be not as fast as I think we'd all like to see. I think it is going to take some of those big players, and a couple of them are out there right now, moving in that direction. And I think you'll see that come to bear in the next 6 to 12 months, where it gets a lot of buzz in the industry. There's a lot more podcasts, there's a lot more discussion at seminars and conferences about it. I do think the value proposition, like even with Windows Hello, right? And just, how can you, to your point, be truly passwordless? Are you going to use a second factor? Maybe it's something like an Okta Verify, but you still have user ID and password. Or are you truly going to go passwordless and you partner with like maybe Hyper and you use a cell phone, right? And you can actually get to that state. The other thing I would throw out, though, just being maybe you can call me extra cautious or what have you. One of the things I like with it, if you ask me, hey, what would be your ideal implementation of, truly passwordless? It would be passwordless for almost everything, but I would also have the ability to do a third step up. So in that example of the firewall technician who is now completely working from home because he said, listen, I'm not coming back into the office anymore. And he's that unicorn that we can't find, so we have to accommodate him, right? Um, and he's sitting in his Starbucks, having his breakfast, right? And we're two-factoring him in to make a firewall change. Well, I wanted to go one extra step, right? I want to do a third step up to a hard token, right? I want to see him put a YubiKey in there or another form of a hard token, and I want him carrying it around with him when he's making a firewall change, right? So will I use that for everything? No, but I would use it for very sensitive changes like that just as an extra security measure.
Yeah, that risk-based authentication approach makes a lot of sense. And I do want to give a shout out to one Cosmos because we did have Mike Engel on the show earlier this year. So if folks are interested in learning more about them, I would encourage them to go out and look up episode number 96 of the Identity Center podcast because it was a great conversation around passwordless. But I definitely agree. I think this is the future. I think it's taken a while to get there. We've seen Windows Hello and things like Touch ID have done a lot for the space when it comes to desktops and mobile phones. And even if it's not true passwordless, I still think there's a value and a benefit there, even just from a usability standpoint that, I hope more organizations will start to take advantage of as they go through their hardware refresh cycles that, gives their employees the Windows Hello capable camera, right? Or the Touch ID or the fingerprint reader on their laptop. So those sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously a lot of work going on in the space, right? Whether it's through FIDO or through NIST and some of the other, you know, areas that are focusing on standards and practices in the space. So it's exciting to see all the movement.
Jeff, you gave a shout out to Mike from One Cosmos, who's a fantastic guest. We had Frank V on from Hyper, episode 103. The takeaway I had from both of those was, this is one of the few areas where you can actually increase security and improve the user experience at the same time. So that's one of the great things about passwordless. And the other thing is, the realization that from a passwordless perspective, you might think, well, password plus an MFA is better than passwordless alone. And I think that the untruth there is kind of what Tom talked about earlier, right? You either have these really weak passwords that can be broken in no time, or these really complex passwords that, really nudges the users to cheat, to come up with passwords that are going to be easy to remember, even though they have to be, ridiculously long. For the average end user, they're not going to use a passport wallet or a password wallet, something like a one pass. One pass, is that right?
Yeah, one pass or
Yeah.
LastPass or even they'll just write it down, right?
Or you could just write it down on a sticky and put it under your keyboard. But ultimately, I think that's the point of passwordless, right? Is to not have a weak form of MFA covering up, a extremely difficult for a human password policy. It's using biometrics. It's using something completely out of band that's not phishable. So improved user experience and at the same time actually improving security.
Yeah. I mean, the only other thing I'd add is that, to your point about as companies are thinking about how do I up my game in my authentication space, right? I will say, there are companies out there that think going from an 8-character password to a 16-character password is, a great advantage. And gives them, yes, it gives you a stronger password, which is much more difficult to obviously crack when it's that long. But Jim, it goes back to your point about user experience, right? I mean, unless you're going to pass phrases and things like that, I mean, people are going to start writing down these 16-character passwords, right? And it's just that would be a really bad practice, right? So anyway, but I think that your point's well made there.
So, Tom, you've been extremely generous with your time today. Thank you for giving back to the podcast and to the IAM practitioners who listen to the podcast. We like to end the show on a lighter note, And I was completely aggravated this morning. And in all transparency, we're recording the show about a month before it's going to air. So this didn't actually happen this morning when people are listening, but it was this morning for me. I saw the news that a website called the Pizza Modernist has declared Portland, Oregon as the best pizza city in America. And as our guest and
Oh,
our
bupkis.
our resident Italian American, I would assume that you don't agree that Portland is the best pizza city. But anyway, what is the best pizza city?
Oh, come on, guys. You know what the best pizza city is. New York, man. Come on.
Chicago, Chicago.
Oh, no, man. The deep dish favorite. So listen, I went up to New York a couple weeks ago, right, to see my mom and family because it's been 18 months, right? And the first thing I did, and when growing up in Staten Island, New York City, my mom lives across the street from a great bar and pizza place that we've always went to called the Roadhouse. Got there after 12 hours of driving, called her up. I said, let's go eat some pizza, right? I mean, I had to get my fix in. But yeah, I mean, I tell you, down here in Charlotte, it's kind of hard to find three things: good pizza, good bagels, and good bread. But yeah, there's lots of good cities that make good pizza. But Jeff, come on, you got to admit, man, there's nothing better than New York. I mean, come on.
You know what? I don't discriminate. I like all pizza. I subscribe to the belief that even bad pizza is still pretty good. um, so here's a question I want to follow up on. So I think we can argue all day long. What is the best pizza, right? And everyone's going to say it's Chicago, of course. But what's the worst pizza you've ever had?
Oh, yeah. I'll be honest. I mean, we went to a couple places here in Charlotte when we got here. I won't say the name because I don't want to offend anybody if they're fans of it, but it's a chain. And of course, one of the neighbors said to me, "Oh, yeah, you're from New York. You want to try XYZ pizza?" And it was, oh man, it was bad. So yeah.
So there's a local shop. What about you, Jim? What's the worst pizza you've had?
I think Domino's is the worst. I mean, I moved down to the south I lived in North Jersey, which is pretty much a New York City suburb. So we have a lot of great New York style pizza. And then I grew up in Philadelphia, and there's a lot of New York style pizza. Actually, Philly is really cool because they have representation of all the different styles of pizza from around the country. Not Portland, but uh, anyway, moving to the South, people go to Pizza Hut and Papa John's. People talk about Papa John's like it's gourmet,
Yeah.
but I've got to say Domino's is the absolute worst. I don't know how they stay in business.
Well, I think you like the Detroit style pizza, though, right?
So yeah, Tom and I worked for Ally Financial, major, which flourished out of the ashes of GMAC. That's a whole other story, but it was based in Detroit, in the Renaissance Center, the GM headquarters, which is right next to a part of Detroit called Greektown. And I never really even knew there was a Detroit style pizza, but Detroit is where Little Caesars began. The Illich family started it. Anyway, I fell in love with that pizza. It's that square deep dish pizza with the real thick crust, kind of like from if you know New York pizza, it's like the Sicilian pizza.
Yeah.
It's just fantastic, man.
Yeah, they
That's
did
what I
have some
love.
good pizza there. You're right. Greektown was a cool place to go to. Except you didn't. The only thing bad about Greektown, you had to be careful about walking back to the hotel, after like 11 o'clock. But other than that, it
Yeah,
was okay.
as long as you didn't step on anybody who was sleeping on a grate, you're probably okay.
That's right. Yeah.
That's when you hope the pizza was worth it.
Yeah.
The worst pizza I've ever had, unfortunately, I had in Paris, France.
Wow,
Um,
really? Okay.
I was out there on a trip with my wife. I think it was a couple of years ago, and I had actually we were walking around, and we actually met her parents, my in-laws, out there. It was kind of a cool trip, right? We're staying near the Louvre, and we were walking around looking for food one night, and we saw a pizza place, and we were excited, like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds good. Let's get a pizza. Let's go back to the hotel that we had that had like a nice balcony. It was we did it right if we're gonna go if we're gonna go to Paris. We did it right, and we go into this pizza place, and we get it back to the hotel room, and this was a legendarily bad pizza. Like, it is a memory that I have of Paris having the worst pizza ever that any of us had had. It wasn't even just me. It was like we all agreed that this was the worst pizza that ever came out of us, and it became the pizza story for our family, from Paris. So as much as we really enjoyed being in Paris, and the food was generally excellent, I could not recommend this pizza place. And it was just a little side place, on the street, kind of like, any place else you'd probably find, walking the streets of Paris. But it was
What made it so bad?
It was, well, first of all, it was basically just dough. There was barely any cheese on it. I don't know if there was any tomato sauce to begin with on it. And then there was like 3 basil leaves that were just on top of it. And that was it. And it had no flavor. Like, the dough was just plain. It was just, it was like what you would make if you didn't have the ingredients to make a pizza, but this is what you had in the house, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, you needed to go a few hundred miles south of there. To that little country that's shaped like a boot, you would have gotten some good pizza.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, definitely. Well, Tom, you've been really generous with your time, and I appreciate it, and I'm sure so do our listeners. Before we let you go for the week, any words of wisdom that you'd like to kind of share with our audience?
No, just to say I really enjoyed being on the show. I love the name of the show, by the way, which is Identity at the Center, because I actually preach to a lot of people that identity is the center of all things security. So it's very apropos that I am now on your show and preaching that, and the show is named that way. So, but thank you for having me on, and I hope to see you guys again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. Jim, how about yourself?
I'm just going to repeat something I say all the time. For anyone who's made it to this point in the podcast, please reach out, get connected with me and Jeff and Tom on LinkedIn. We're looking to expand our networks, and we learn as much from you guys as you learn from us. So let's keep that dialogue going, and we'd love to get feedback on things that you want to hear more about on the show. Please connect.
And the offer still stands. If you're a Lotus Notes proponent and you think that it's a good solution for IAM, please contact us. I'm serious, right? Let's have the conversation, right? Let's talk about it and see what's going on. All right, I think with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. I'll have links in the show notes where you can connect with Tom on LinkedIn, and also link to the article that he wrote for the IDSA around a single identity management and security strategy for hybrid clouds. Tom, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening. Please share it with a friend, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating. If you don't like the show, share it with an enemy. That's cool too, as long as we have listeners. That's fine with us. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.